So today's lecture is on economic growth and the business cycle. It's based on a book called Time and Money, The Macroeconomics of Capital Structure by a man named Roger Garrison. This is an excellent book, but it's a bit more advanced, although I think it's readable for anyone. It's intended for a more advanced economics audience, but I think the presentation, it's a very graphical presentation, it's a very visual presentation about how the economy grows and why it doesn't. And on Monday's lecture, we talked about how to measure economic growth. Today's lecture is all about understanding the mechanics of economic growth. And the business cycle, we'll get to that too. So, what is the economy? The economy is a process. The market is a process. It's not just a place at a specific time and location. It's something that happens over time. It involves lots of people. It involves planning ahead, anticipating the future. And what we need to do as economists is to understand the intertemporal, the changes that happen between time that organizations do and entrepreneurs embark on and consumers embark on, to understand how they plan for the future, how they anticipate the future, and how they use the past and present in order to make their judgments. So that's what the economy is. It's a process. It's not something that's stationary. It's something that's moving. It's something that's dynamic. So let's get a little bit deeper into what that means. So let me introduce this term called macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole. So mostly in this class we've talked about microeconomics. That's the economics of individual interaction between one person and one person. Macroeconomics looks at how the whole economy interacts in aggregate. So it gets tricky when you're looking at the macroeconomy, but we do have some tools. The basic tools we have are the production possibilities frontier. We covered this earlier in the semester. The loanable funds market, the structure of production. We will be talking about these later, and labor markets we mean uh, in each stage of production, in each stage of the structure of production, we will have different labor markets. It's not going to be an aggregate labor market for the whole economy. We're going to break it down. We're going to break down the economy into different segments, and we'll have different labor markets for each segment. So, what are some applications of macroeconomics? First, we can understand what sustainable growth even means. And the punchline is that sustainable growth is supported by saving. And unsustainable growth, what that means is that it's triggered by credit creation. Credit creation goes back to our lectures discussing the money creation process and the Fed and central banking, that kind of stuff. So there are three different views you should be aware of when it comes to macroeconomics. You'll hear these names a lot if you read the news and financial media a lot. The first man is John Maynard Keynes. People who follow his advice are known as Keynesians. And what Keynesians believe is what causes economic busts, economic crashes, are psychological phenomena. And they have a fancy word for this. It's called animal spirits. Sometimes people get taken over by animal spirits and they enter into panic, herd behavior, they sell off, they make decisions that they shouldn't, and they fall into what we talked about the other day about the paradox of savings, where they're hoarding too much money and they're ruining the economy that way because of psychological issues. Next is this man, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman says that is part of something called the monetarist school, and the monetarist school says that the only thing that's important to look at when you're looking at the economy in aggregate is the aggregate level of money supply. And when you're looking at the aggregate money supply, then you can see they got a famous equation for this called the equation of exchange, MV equals PQ, sometimes written MV equals PY, where it's the supply of money times the velocity of money, which is how fast people are changing hands, should be equal to the prices of all the goods in the economy times the quantity of all the goods in the economy. It's very aggregative, and people who follow Mr. Friedman here, Nobel Prize winner, they're called monetarists or Friedmanites, and that leads us to our third character of interest. This is a man named Friedrich Hayek. His name has come up a lot during this class. He's also a Nobel Prize winner in economics from Austria originally, and he has a view that the economy is about entrepreneurship, anticipating future demands, and how prices provide information and signals in the present for future, to help make future decision making. So before we really get into the technical stuff, we should have a methodological, abbreviation, a methodological understanding, which is that before we can ask how things can go wrong, we first have to explain how they could ever go right. And this is a problem because whenever we get into a situation where there's a crisis in the economy, everyone is focused right there and then on the crisis. How do we solve the crisis? How do we solve the crisis? Mr. Hayek said, if you really want to understand how to solve a crisis, you got to figure out what caused the crisis to begin with. You got to understand how things could even go right to prevent crises to begin with. And that's why we're going to start off this lecture by understanding what sustainable growth is and then how it can become unsustainable. So back to our little economy again. First, we're going to talk about the production possibilities frontier. It's going to be slightly different than how we looked at it earlier. So the production possibilities frontier in this lecture is going to have two axes. It's the vertical axis is consumption. The horizontal axis is investment. And consumption, you can think of as the number of consumption goods made available at a specific period of time. And the investment is the number of investment goods. And investment goods are goods that you're required in order to make in the present, in order to make consumption goods in the future. You can be somewhere along this PPF. Wherever you are along this PPF, that means you are doing things as efficiently as possible. You can be anywhere along this PPF in order to be efficient. And wherever you are, you see a area where there's a corresponding consumption level and a corresponding investment level. So this represents gross investment. This is worthwhile to point out. Gross investment, aka total investment. This is made up of replacement capital, which is just making sure that the capital that you have right now, the investments that you have right now, don't just wither away and die. You're just replacing them. And then a little bit extra is net investment. That's the stuff that you're adding new to the economy. So we can watch this PPF grow over time. So this is 4 stages of the PPF. Each stage, the PPF grew a little bit, and over time, you get both more consumption and more investment. So let's move back our graph, and let's get rid of the lines. And let's see now what happens when we shift from consumption to investment. When you shift from consumption to investment, you're supposed to be moving along the curve there, and you're just moving down from the consumption to investment. So you get a new level of consumption and a new level of investments, lower consumption, more investments. How does this affect growth? Well, let's see. You are growing in 4 periods, but you're growing faster than you were before. Because of the extra investment, you get to grow faster than you did before. We can compare this growth rates after savings and before savings. Here's our high savings rate PPF and our low savings rate PPF. And you can see, originally we both had the same level of consumption, but after savings over 4 periods, we're able to consume more and invest more. That's just how the PPFs grow. Okay, so that was it for the PPF. Let's now talk about the loanable funds market. So loanable funds, fun name, it's just a market for loans. It's a market like any other where we have our supply and demand. Except instead of prices in the loanable funds, we talk about interest rates. And instead of the quantity of loanable funds, we're talking about savings, the quantity of savings, and the quantity of investment. And the supply curve is how much people are saving, and the demand curve is how much people are demanding from savers in order to invest. Savings in equilibrium, savings equal investment. So when people increase the savings rate, they're shifting the savings curve out, and that allows for more stuff to be invested at a lower interest rate. So let's now look at what happens when people increase their savings and how that affects the PPF. So you can see we can line them up because they share the same investment axis. Because they share the same investment axis, we can line them up. So we say that at the equilibrium savings rate, at the equilibrium interest rate where we get the equilibrium savings, we get the equilibrium investment that matches up to the PPF. And so when we increase the savings rate, we're moving along the PPF. Let's move on now from the loanable funds market onto the structure of production. So we've never talked about the structure of production formally before, but we've made hints about it. So the structure of production looks like no other graph you've seen before. It is a triangle. It is a triangle made up of different stages, different segments. And each segment here represents a different stage of production. And the y-axis here, that represents the total number of consumption goods available to consume. So the taller it is, the more consumer goods you can produce. So we have the early stages here and the late stages here. This is early in time, okay? So the closer you get to the point of the triangle is the earlier in time. That's your product development, your research development, etc. And up here, in later stages, that's when you're taking care of inventory and bringing goods to market. So we can think about what's happening when we add oil, add steel, and what happens if we add a little bit of engineering to the early stages and see what comes out at the end. So they're going through the stages of production, and then let's see how they produce. Oh, they made some cars. Wow. Oil, steel, and engineering went together, and they went through the stage of production over time, and they ended up with some cars. For any car buffs, that was the Ford Model A. So let's now compare the stages of production to the PPF. So notice that stages of production and the PPF both share the same y-axis of consumption goods. Okay? That means we can line them up. And now let's see what happens when the PPF is growing. Here it's growing, that's the third and fourth stage. We're now at this point on the new PPF, and then our triangle here grows bigger. It gets bigger. It keeps the same shape, but it gets bigger. As it gets bigger, it also adds more stages of production. The more efficient, the more rich you become, the more advanced you become, the more stages of production you can add. You can go further back in time. You can take longer to produce things. So you can dig deeper wells, you can dig deeper mines in order to get more rare materials out of the earth, in order to build more advanced consumer goods such as phones, etc. So let's see what happens when we increase the rate of investment. When we increase the rate of investment, as expected, you can see that you will see that the PPF is going to increase faster. But before that happens, our structure of production gets shorter but longer. It gets shorter, which means we're consuming less in the present, but it gets longer because we're investing more also in the present in order to produce in the future. We can also add these now stage-specific labor markets. So in these early stages, we have a labor market, supply and demand. W is wages, N is number of workers, and same thing with the late stages. Well, what happens when we increase investments? Well, once again, our triangle gets shorter but longer. But you'll also see that the demand for late stage workers fell, but the demand for early stage employers rose. So once again, we have more stages of production, and there's going to be a supply and demand for every stage. But generally, you can see that the number of workers leave these late stage areas and get moved into the early stage areas. So now let's watch the economy grow. It's growing faster, and we get more consumption goods and a longer triangle. You can also see what happens to consumption over time in a graph like this. So the horizontal axis is time. Consumption was going up. People started saving, so they're consuming less. And then because of the investments are now more efficient, the rate of consumption is able to go up faster. So what that means is that we lost out on all this area of consumption in the short term, but we gained instead all these potential future avenues of consumption that we missed out on otherwise. If we never invested, this is the amount of consumption we would have had the whole time. Let's move on now to the final piece of our puzzle. And well, that was those were the three pieces that we needed. And now let's talk about credit expansion. How do those things come together, and how can we talk about credit expansion? Well, before we discuss credit expansion, let's review what happens when we have our supply and demand for loanable funds. So normally when the supply and demand goes, when the supply of savings shifts out, you get a lower interest rate. But you also get a supply shifting out when you get an increase in the supply of money, but the savings rate remains the same. Delta M is an increase in the supply of money. Increasing in the supply of money lowers the interest rate, just as if it were a real increase in savings. But you'll notice that there's going to be some problems later. And this is going to be the fact that real savers, they're going to be saving less than they otherwise would have. They're saving less, but investors are trying to invest more. before we see how that really affects the economy, let's look at how an economy is supposed to work. And here our loanable funds market, our production possibilities frontier, and our stages of production. So let's see, they line up nicely. And here is what Roger Garrison called poetry in motion. And here's what happens when savings increases naturally. Everything works out. Savings increases naturally. You get a lower interest rate. You get more investments. You get less consumption in the present, but more investments, which means more growth in the future. Now, let's bring it together with our problems of the credit expansion. So what happens when we expand credit? So once again, things line up initially, but now we expand credit. That's our supply with our change in the money. Here, notice that we had our two different equilibrium points leading to two different points on our production possibilities frontier. The two different points on the in the loanable funds market, consumers are saving less and consuming more. They used to be consuming at this level, but now because they're saving less, because the interest rate is lower, they're consuming more instead. They're using their savings to consume. But the signal, because of the low interest rate, the signal that investors have gotten is that consumers are saving more. So they're investing more in the future. So by investing more, they're trying to move the PPF to somewhere lower down along the investments axis. What this leads to is that the PPF is going to try to reach some virtual points beyond the PPF. And that's unsustainable because the PPF is your possibilities for production. It's your sustainable possibilities for production. And if you're above that, you're consuming too much. And this is how you can see you're consuming too much, where this is the level you were supposed to be consuming. This is overconsumption here. These, whoops. So we've got this difference here is our going to be our overconsumption because relative to investments, we're consuming too much. And then over here, this difference here, this is malinvestment. Investors are investing in the wrong things. They're investing in the wrong things for people in the future. People do not want long-term goods. They want present-term goods. So they end up with by making goods that they're not going to be able to sell. The analogy you can think of is this. Imagine you are a master builder, an architect, and you've been told that you have 1,000 bricks to build a house. So you make some plans thinking that you had 1,000 bricks and you want to use every single one of them. Halfway into your project, you find out that you didn't have 1,000 bricks, you actually had 800. And that's the malinvestment, that's the unsustainable boom. You had started building this house. You had started building a house on the understanding that you were going to have 1,000 bricks to build, but oopsie, you end up with 800. Now here's the punchline. Why does the supply what causes the money supply to increase? It's because the money printer goes burr, and then we've got the coronavirus here, and people start hoarding toilet paper. Look also what happens to the this triangle here. We get a case of dueling triangles because at first the triangle here wants to get shorter because people are consuming more. But at the same time, it wants to get longer because people are investing more. So it's a situation where the structure of production is out of alignment. Instead of getting a smooth slope, you get this disjointed kink in the shape of the triangle. That's part of the problem. Let's look at this process again. increase in the supply of money causes investors to think that there's interest rates are low, so they think that it's time to invest. But it causes savers to save less because interest rates are low, not because people have saved anymore, but because the central bank has inflated the market, but with paper money, and so that they are saving less and consuming more. This causes the PPF to try to split off into two and reach a virtual point, and our triangle here is trying to make two different triangles. So the economy is trying to reach this virtual point outside the PPF, but because it can't, there's a crash and it comes back down. We got a money printer. We got the people freaking out allegedly because of the coronavirus, but they don't see the money printer behind the scenes, and then end up with people overhauling or hoarding toilet paper. So that was my presentation, and I think I am ready for questions. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. What does Keynes mean by animal spirits? He means people are taken over by emotions akin to animals. They stop thinking like humans. They start behaving like animals. They just start partaking in herd behavior. They're just doing what everyone else is doing instead of stopping and thinking rationally. That's what Keynes means by animal spirits. People get taken over instead of their human spirit is animal spirit. Any other questions? So if there are more investments, is there more opportunity for efficiency in the stages of production? The more investment you can do, the more you can elongate the stages of production. The more you can take a longer period of time to produce. So right now, making a phone requires something called rare earth minerals, and rare earth minerals are called that because they're rare inside the crust of the earth, and you have to dig deep and dig for a long time in order to find any. And so we couldn't have made it's very expensive to get rare earth minerals as a result, and we couldn't have dug for these minerals without the literal centuries of capital accumulation going on that enabled this. So that's why when people talk about invention and innovation and all this stuff, they really need to appreciate the fact that we need economic growth to begin with before you can even think of innovation. Because what good would it have done anyone if someone in ancient in the Stone Age came up with the idea for a smartphone, where we didn't have any of the production processes in place in order to make smartphones? If people save now, it will cause a decrease in investment now, but higher investment in the future. Yes, it will make people richer off in the future in order to they'll have more money than they would have otherwise, so that they will have more to invest. Even if, as a proportion of their income, they're investing less as a proportion, the total amount that they do invest will be larger. But just historically, as people tend to get richer, they tend to invest more of their income as opposed to consuming it. That's a historical fact for you. on the first PPF graph, is the net investments just the rightmost vertical line? No, it's the little space, the space between the gross investments and the replacement capital. Let's go back. We got to go to our green section. No, orange section. So we have the replacement capital, orange section. That's this area here is the replacement capital. This area here is net investments. Any other questions? When the PPF curve moves outward, that's economic growth. That's right. When the PPF moves, the production possibilities move. It becomes possible to produce more goods. That's the production possibilities frontier. As it gets bigger, as it moves out, you're producing more, or it's possible to produce more if you're producing efficiently. Any other questions? Should the PPF only have 1 point on it? In sustainable growth, the PPF is only where the economy is only at 1 point on the PPF. In unsustainable growth, that's when the economy is trying to get to 2 different points on the PPF, which are contradictory. It's trying to consume more and invest less. At the same time, it's trying to invest more and consume less. So that's the reason when the economy is trying to reach 2 different points on the PPF, it's unsustainable. It tries to produce too much and consume too much, and it has to result in people being less efficient because they've been tricked by the signal sent by the central bank through money printing. What was the name of the first man who had the first view of the 3 macroeconomics? That was Keynes. That's right. Could you give us another real-life example of these mechanics? This is a model of the whole economy at work, and the PPF is everything that you're producing and consuming. That's your video games that you're playing, that they're selling at this time. It is also the video games that are in development. It's the mining that's in the PPF and the jewelry, the finished jewelry that's in the PPF. On the structural production side, you've got R&D at the far end of the structural production. You can get the finance and marketing in the middle part of the structural production, and the later part of the structural production, you have people bringing goods to market. You have people doing door-to-door deliveries, all these things. So if the Fed is right now trying to trick investors to invest more by printing more money right now during the pandemic, that is the view presented in this model. This is the Hayekian model. Let me be clear. This is the Hayekian model. Keynesians and monetarists, and they have different views about how the economy works. I think those are mistaken views, so I'm teaching you what I think is the correct theory. The central bank thinks that they're doing 2 things at the central bank right now. So they're providing short-term loans, as well as for the financial institutions need short-term loans because they have a lot of assets that they can't sell right away, or they don't want to sell right away because they think if they sell, They won't get the best price that they can for it, or it might take too long to sell them. So the central banks come in and they'll say, we will take your word that your investments are good enough, and we'll give you all this money, free cash, in order for you to do whatever you want with it. And they can do two things. They can use that cash, keep it at their accounts at the central bank, which it earns about 0.1% interest, or they can use it to pay their bonuses for their employees, or they can use it to make extra loans. Right now, things are really tricky. So interest rates in Canada have dropped to about 0.25%, which is the central bank is trying to incentivize the commercial banks to print more, to make more loans, etc. But what's happened to mortgage rates is that some banks, like Scotiabank, they've actually increased their mortgage rates, even though that the rate that they're getting from the central bank is lower. Why? Because the mortgage market is also supply and demand, and even though the supply of loanable funds for mortgages has gone up, so has the demand for mortgages. This is partly driven by the fact that a lot of people are losing their jobs, so that they are less likely to make their mortgage payments. So they can't make their mortgage payments, so the banks are raising their mortgage rates in order to make sure that people who qualify for the higher rate can pay their mortgages later on. Similar to Corona, could you dissect another instance in which growth is disrupted? Oh, sure. Here's the thing. So I call this the business cycle. So what is the cycle? So I just described the boom and one bust. The cycle is when there is a bust, when the economy falls back within the PPF, the central bank response isn't to just let markets clear, is to print more money. They print more money, and so it incentivizes more malinvestments and overconsumption, and then so you get another boom, and then over time you get another bust, and then that's the cycle. It's the cheap credit followed by the bust, followed by more cheap credit, followed by the bust. That's the cycle. But that's not the only time when the economy can crash. For example, if there's a hurricane or if there's a war, those moments, experiences cause economic crashes, but we don't call those the business cycle. Economic crashes can be caused by all sorts of things that reduce our production possibilities, war and hurricanes, and if everybody just suddenly became part of a weird cult where we all had to sit at home and do nothing all day, that would also reduce our production possibilities and cause the economy to crash. So these would be examples of crashes that wouldn't be caused by the business cycle. The cycle is unsustainable because it keeps happening and it keeps destroying capital in the meantime. Net capital, because we keep falling within the PPF, and when you're within the PPF, you're by definition not efficient. Whereas without money printing, without credit expansion, you get smooth growth. Even though some people will make mistakes along the way, you get smooth growth and smooth transitions from one market to another over time without any major crashes, assuming you don't get any blights or hurricanes or viruses or what have you. We have 5 more minutes. Any other questions? Is credit expansion part of the business cycle? Yes. So the business cycle is caused by credit expansion. The reason we have a business cycle is because of credit expansion. Without credit expansion, we get the normal sustainable growth that I showed earlier in the presentation. Without credit expansion, we have real supply and demand for savings and loans and investments, leading to a sustainable position on the PPF, which leads to a normal smooth triangle. When you have credit expansion, it's what creates the tug of war along the PPF, and what creates those dueling triangles, which creates havoc in the marketplace, where people are trying to consume more than they were before and also invest more than they were before. But there's just not enough resources in the economy to satisfy both those ends. Will the extra printing of money right now cause hyperinflation? I don't know. I don't think so. We haven't printed that much money, but that's, you never say never. The difference is with the United States when they print money is that everyone in the world uses United States dollars. They have the largest market share of all currencies, so they have the most room to print money without people really noticing the difference. That's not to say that it's always easy. In the 1970s, there was a period called stagflation, where there was double-digit inflation. It was 10 up to 15% inflation per year, and that was it was also matched by high unemployment relatively, and it was a very troubling period. And the way that they fixed it, a man named Volcker came into power at the Federal Reserve, and he jacked up interest rates to 20%, and that stopped the money printing, and that stopped the inflation as well. What are the positives of credit expansion? Well, for the people who get the new money first, there's lots of positives. They get the new money first, and so they can spend the money before prices have risen for everyone else. So they get real wealth before everyone else has to lose their paper wealth. And it's really beneficial for those people. But overall for the economy, it's a net negative. Was the recent drop in the Canadian dollar caused by the printing of money or due to economic factors like slowing the economy? So the drop in the Canadian dollar, there's the market for international people to hold the Canadian dollar is determined in large part by how much Canada is exporting. And one of Canada's largest exports is oil. And so Canada's foreign exchange ratios are determined in large part by oil, but they're also determined by how much other countries are printing money. So it's possible that all countries can be printing money, but some countries print money at a faster rate than others, which will cause the relative currencies to appreciate in value if you're not printing as much money as everyone else. All the monies are losing value on an absolute basis, but relatively some currencies get to gain value against others. Why has the price of gas decreased so dramatically? Well, because people aren't driving anymore. It's supply and demand, that's part of it. The demand for gasoline has dropped a lot, but Saudi Arabia has also increased their production of gasoline at the same time. It's part of a trade war they're having with Russia and the United States. What about Russia? I think I just addressed that. When do the repeated busts finally end? Or rather, at what point does the cycle begin anew? The cycle begins anew after there's a crash, a recession or depression, etc. And the policy response is to print more money. Okay? It doesn't have to be like this. There was a famous recession in 1920. It lasted about 18 months. it was a sharper decline, a sharper recession initially than what the Great Depression turned out to be. But there was no policy response of printing more money. They weren't expanding credit in response to that. So within less than a year, it just jumped back up. The economy just jumped back up, and that was taken care of easily. But throughout the 20s, that's when the Fed and other central banks started printing a lot more money, which led to the crash of 1929. And the reason that things got extended throughout the 30s and the Depression was that there were price controls and rations and other restrictions on the economy that limited what entrepreneurs could do. And then some people say what got us out of the Great Depression was the World War II. That's ridiculous. It's like you're killing people to get out of an economic slump. No. What happened was after World War II, a lot of those restrictions on the economy were removed, and that freed up a lot of capital, a lot of wealth. And even though people were anticipating after World War II, because they had this Keynesian notion that consumption was going to be devastated after World War II because the government wasn't spending enough anymore, people came back. The government cut back spending dramatically, but they freed up resources for entrepreneurs to use. That allowed more production to take place and allowed the economy to get revitalized. I think we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys on Friday.